AO 2020-58 and conditional use requirements for homeless and transient centers. And go ahead, Mandy, do a roll call, please.
Okay. Mr. Weddleton?
Here.
Ms. Kennedy? Mr. Peterson? Mr. Constant?
Here.
Mr. Dunbar?
Mandy Kennedy's here.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Mr. Dunbar?
I'm here, but I'm not a member of the subcommittee, so I'll be coming in and out.
Ms. Salatel?
Here.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Here.
And then for non-CEDC members, Mr. Rivera? Mr. Perez Verdia? Ms. Allard?
Here.
Ms. LaFrance? Chairs, you have a quorum.
All right, thank you. And then from staff, who do we have? Or administration, sorry.
This is Michelle McNulty, the planning director.
This is Nancy Burke. I'm just on for listening.
Oh, good.
This is Quincy Arms with the Municipal Attorney's Office.
Okay. I see Dean Gates and Chris Schutte.
Yeah, Dean. Yes.
Okay. Okay, so Michelle, for I guess for the public, could you go through the PowerPoint fairly quickly then? And then Quincy, when we hit points that touch on your fair housing, you want to go through them then as you hit them?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, Chris?
Yeah, so this is for Dean. Dean, there's a new feature on Teams. If you click the three dots under your face or under the main body, and you click on turn on live captions, it is an amazing setup. Now you can get immediate instant live captioning.
Oh, yes. I used that last week, and it works pretty well, although there's a bunch of typos. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. All right.
Okay, Michelle?
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. So this is Michelle McNulty, the planning director. And the intent of this is to keep it very brief, but just to give a high-level overview for any new members of the public that are going to join us. Should I do a share screen?
That'd be fine. Does that get recorded when that happens, or is the recording just voice?
It records the screen share as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Can everybody see my screen? You should see the front page of the CEDC work session, AO 2020-58.
Yes.
Great. So we're going to start talking. The basic agenda for today is kind of why we're here, a brief overview of the basic zoning definitions and process. And then before we start talking about the potential path forward, we'll have Quincy weigh in on some of the legal interpretation that's been provided to the group, and then can move forward with discussion on the two different paths forward. Her discussion may change how we address this, and we may focus on one process versus both of those. And then we'll continue with what that process looks like for amending Title 21, regardless of the potential path that's chosen to move forward. So the reason why we're here is to allow homeless and transient shelters in the B3 zoning districts. Currently, homeless shelters are only limited to one zoning, which is in the public lands and institution, and it makes it really hard to provide additional beds. Allowing shelters in the business zoning district is more compatible than allowing them in either residential or industrial zoning districts. And B3 is the most common non-residential zoning district that we have in the Anchorage Bowl, as demonstrated in the map that you see on the screen. Looking at a variety of other communities across the country, they already allow or have expanded homeless shelters to be allowed in their business zone. So this is in line with what other communities are doing. Previously, I went through the different definitions for zoning district, permitted use, conditional use. So very briefly, just every parcel of land within the bowl has a zoning designation. Within that zoning designation, there are uses that are allowed as a permitted use, and that means by right, still subject to Title 21 standards. There are uses that are allowed through approval of a conditional use. They can be approved conditionally, and that the approval documents what their site plan and operation should look like. There's also uses that can be approved through a special land use permit, and that's for specific approvals for uses that have been determined to be more intense or greater impact than a permitted or conditional use within that same zoning district. There's a condition of approval, and that's an affirmative action by a commissioner or a council, in this case the assembly, indicating that approval is contingent upon satisfaction of certain specified stipulations. And then just wanted to distinguish between the assembly, the legislative branch of the municipality, charged with setting policy for the municipality, versus the Planning and Zoning Commission, which is a group of people appointed by the city council. And as Mr. Constant noted last time, in this case, it's actually appointed by the mayor that administers planning and land use regulations on a wide array of land use and land use policy issues. Sorry, I didn't get that slide updated to reflect that. So this is a flow pattern of what our conditional use process looks like. The pre-application meeting, there's a required community meeting before an application is even submitted. The first choice for that meeting does need to be the community council in which the site resides in, and 21-day notice is to be required to anybody living within 500 feet. That includes property owners and renters. Once an applicant submits their application, we check it for completeness, and each submittal deadline is tied to a public hearing date. And there's typically about 60 days from the submittal application to the respite public hearing date. The applications are routed to a variety of departments and agencies for comment. At the same time, the application is also uploaded and available for public review. At that point, the public can start providing written comment in a variety of forms. The staff report is then finalized. We have those usually wrapped up within 1 week of the public hearing, and then make that available. That has includes all the public comment and department comments that we've received, and with the staff's recommendation to the board or commission that's reviewing that. Then there's a public hearing. Each public hearing has the same 21-day mailing notice requirement within 500 feet to both property owners and to renters. Public testimony is heard at that hearing, and even anybody who has provided public testimony in writing or via calling the staff person to give it to them can still testify at the public hearing. The commission makes findings of facts. They accept or modify the conditions of approval and take final action. These are the 9 approval criteria that are required to be met as part of conditional use permit approval. I won't go through them all. And just summarizing some of the concerns that we've heard from the assembly regarding the current conditional use process is that it lacks a robust community involvement, and really focusing on the lack of the involvement to the neighbors outside of that publicly noticed area. The approval criteria is vague, and for the instance of homeless and transient shelter, one of the concerns that we've heard is that the final approval is from Planning and Zoning Commission, and that there's no assembly review or approval, that there's no annual review of an approved conditional use permit, and that it's also really hard to revocate a conditional use permit. And so before we start talking about the potential paths forward, Quincy, would you like to weigh in at this time with some of the information that you've provided?
That's fine. Yeah, thank you. And thank you to the Assembly for letting me weigh in, and to Dean. So I was asked by the administration to get involved in this process pretty early on, because history has shown when we start proposing changes to our land use code, especially when it comes to housing for disadvantaged groups, it can bring us some unwanted legal attention. Specifically, the concern in this case is the Fair Housing Act, which has a very broad mandate to prevent discrimination against people with disabilities in their search for housing. So originally, the administration and Assembly members had co-sponsored an ordinance which would have expanded the allowed uses in the B3 zoning district to include homeless and transient shelters, because they recognized there was a real need to provide more options for this population. And that was a step in the right direction, I definitely think. But now what we need to do is make sure that whatever options we decide to provide in this new ordinance, whatever options we provide are not done in a discriminatory way. Or in other words, that they're not done in a way that treats homeless shelters differently than other similar uses. And so that's why I'm talking now about our potential, or that's why I'm talking at this point in the presentation, is we're talking about potential approval paths. And I think that's kind of where my hackles were kind of triggered. Is I can't tell you with any certainty that the special land use permit process with a separate license would violate the Fair Housing Act, but to me it looks different enough. It's definitely it would be the only housing or community service facility with that requirement. It would have a completely new public process, a new approving body, new standards, and unfortunately, I think it would come at an increased cost to the user, because it would definitely come at increased cost to the administration. So it's my opinion that the safer route would be to stick with the conditional use permit, which is comparable to other similar uses. And there's not a use that's exactly like a homeless shelter. So there's definitely some room to create conditions, use-specific standards, I think they're called, particular to this use. But that's my opinion for now. And I can take questions now, I can take questions later, or like Meg said, we could just get into the meat of it.
Okay, I think Chris Constant has a question.
I'll wait for Dean.
Okay, Dean, go ahead.
Thank you. So I just wanted to ask first that if that Quincy, you said home shelter and similar uses, what would you consider to be the similar type of uses as a homeless shelter that we have in our code presently?
Yeah, I just had this conversation with the planners because there isn't anything exactly like it. But I think we came up with some combination of, sorry, that's my dog's stupid toy, with habilitative care and a social service facility. I mean, in the one hand, we're providing housing, but it's not exactly like group housing, like group living or those kinds of uses. It's more like a social service facility, but those don't provide overnight housing. So it's kind of in its own category, but habilitative care, social service, those are the kind of the closest two things we could come up with.
I would also, sorry, this is Michelle McNulty. I would add also transitional living facilities.
I'm sorry, so do those have special requirements? Yeah.
Do they have special condition
If I could
standards, you mean?
No,
Yeah,
I think
for the transitional housing and so on.
so. There are, yes, I think you're talking about, there are use-specific standards for habilitative care and for transitional housing.
Okay, I got it. Thanks. I missed the phrasing there. So okay, Dean, are you through?
Yeah, those two uses, habilitative care or transitional housing, I did think that those might be I mean, the most similar uses in our code as well. I think the huge difference here is the homeless shelters for the short term, they're supposed to be overnight stays, right? And the group living uses, transitional living facility and habilitative care are long-term residential facilities. And so I sort of wonder, can we really make a good distinction from homeless shelter from the other uses? And I think one other huge distinction might be, and I haven't actually looked into this, Quincy, but we have in Title 15, our housing and occupancy code, that has sort of like minimum standards based on the US HUD, I think, public housing authorities standards. And that, you know, it was just the basic cleanliness, sanitary living dwelling units are required to be provided. So, but I don't think that applies to homeless shelters. So I, in some ways, think that we can justify this distinction, if I'm correct, in my assumption that doesn't apply to home shelters, that we need a license because homeless shelters don't have that minimum health standards that, since it's not covered by our housing and occupancy code. Actually, I'm sorry, it was Title 16.
I agree, Dean. I think there are distinctions
Do you
to
think
be
that's a good
made.
distinction that might justify?
Yes. I also think, though, and Michelle or Dave, you can correct me if I'm wrong, we don't have a limit for how many days a person can stay in an emergency homeless shelter, right? So they do sometimes end up being a little bit longer than a night or two.
Title 21 does not put a cap on it. I don't know if there's any other code that do, but Title 21 does not.
You know, I would agree it doesn't have a cap, although maybe some, like Brother Francis, has supposed to have a 30-day limit. I think those are soft limits, but I think what we really need to talk about, though, is how it's defined in code. These are defined in code as just overnight and not day-to-day. Actually, what caught my attention to that distinction is the definition of, I think it was habilitative care facility. Actually, I'll come back to this in just a second when I pull up the little language.
All right, thanks, Dean. Well, let's go to Chris. Did you want to jump in? Chris Constant.
Sure. Not really a question, but really not willing to accept at face value the analysis that we should stay with the conditional use because the conditional use has proven a failure. The conditional use is why we're having the painful debate we're having right now, because rightly nobody trusts that the conditional use will provide them any protection from providers who fail to meet the basic standards of being a decent operator. And so I don't know what the path is between where Quincy's at and where Dean's at and keeping us out of the ACLU hell, but we have to find that path.
Okay, thank you. Meg?
Thanks. So yeah, this conversation I think is really interesting, and I dug in a bit to the Fair Housing Act as I want to do. And, I think the Fair Housing Act applicability is kind of a factor test. And I love a factor test because that means it's a bit case by case, or the design of the facility that determines whether or not the Fair Housing Act may apply. And so I don't know, or I'm going to toss it out as an idea, if either the use specific standards or the licensing requirement of the operation somehow could address some of the Fair Housing Act concerns. So we talk about length of stay. We could talk about, duration of stay, intent to return each night, which amenities, is there a program fee or rent? I mean, these are kind of the factors that have been laid out. And if addressing those kind of head on alleviates or mitigates some of the Fair Housing Act concern.
think that was DeQuincy.
I love that idea. It's clear you're an attorney on a path. Yeah, my concern is the standards, is any standards that would make it harder for people to find housing, not standards that are going to make that are going to help them. Obviously, those are good things.
Yeah, I can share the kind of a factor analysis I found out of Hawaii. I found really helpful, and trying to because I think if we talk more about what we mean by transient homeless shelter, and because our code doesn't really get into the nuts and bolts of it, and we never have. And so if we do that, I think then we start to walk away from the idea that it's housing and not intended to do a lot of things. And I think we can get to it. And I think it really would have to be driven on the either use specific standards and the licensing requirements. Then it would maybe open up the ability to do the Title 21 process that we want to do using a special land use permit.
Great. And I've heard Michelle say this a few times too, is I think it would also be important to reach out to the providers and make sure we're not creating standards that are impossible for them to run a shelter, to make it financially viable.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
Dean, you want to jump back in?
Yeah, and I agree as well with what Meg and what you said, Quincy and Michelle. And that's, I think, by defining it a little more, we can get away from Fair Housing Act issues if homeless shelters are really bona fide short-term stays, and that's their intended use. And I guess I was getting to that point where I was going to highlight the distinction a little more in Title 21. We have some sections that are, well, Chapter 2105 is use regulations, and it defines the different uses. And 2105.30 is residential uses. So, obviously housing for Housing Act is going to apply to anything here in 2105.30, that section. So it's got two subsection A and B, and A is dwelling units and households and so forth. And I think that this is an important language here in what it says in defining household living. And this category is characterized by residential occupancy of a dwelling unit by a household, blah, blah, blah. Tenancy is arranged on a month-to-month or longer basis. And that seems to me really stood out because subsection B covers group living. And under group living, we have the habilitative care facility and the transitional living facility. But overall, the group living category, it is characterized by residential occupancy of a structure by a group of people who do not meet the definition of household living. So generally, it's residential, long-term, month-to-month, or longer occupancies, sort of standard. That's how it's defined for everything under the group living category, including assisted living facilities, transitional living facility, which we talked about, and habilitative care facilities. And so in contrast, homeless and transient shelters and community use in section 2105.40. And I think just the way it's defined, we can really distinguish it from long-term occupancy. Now, I actually was surprised when I read one of the case law that Quincy cited, said that a homeless shelter was covered by the Fair Housing Act. I thought they wouldn't be actually. And I wanted to dig into that more and see why it was in that case. And maybe they define homeless shelter a little differently in that case that came out of City of Caldwell. Anyways, so I think this helps us, though, to justify, well, licensing because it's not long-term residential occupancy. Does that make some sense?
It does to me.
Yes.
I think that maybe we can let legal absorb this some more and get back to us on whether the point we have enough of a distinction in you're safe, treating homeless shelters differently than the other similar uses we have identified, transition living and habilitated care facilities.
Okay, Quincy, did you want to embellish that? I see your chat comment.
Oh, I was just writing a note to Dean that I totally went down that rabbit hole of figuring out if shelters were considered housing. So I can I can just give them some more cases. And yeah, I'm happy to keep working on this ordinance.
Yeah, maybe
I feel,
Quincy and I can talk offline.
yeah, I feel like we need to, the administration, if you want us to start drafting, we just need to kind of hear where you want to go. So we're all ears.
So this is Christopher. Oh, I'm sorry. I think Meg's in the queue. Meg.
Yeah. Let's go Meg and then Chris, I got you.
Okay, thanks. So I want to put a fine point on this, I guess, and just pose the question bluntly, because I want to make sure we're using the best use of our time. So do the attorneys, I know you want to do more research. I want to do more research, of course, think that it's worth pursuing the idea of the special land use permit process, or is that off the table if you have to kind of make a decision right now? Should we be putting our time and energy into that process, or is it just a non-starter? I guess I'd like to know the answer to that. Or if it's, I don't know, we need to get back to you, then I think we need to know that and kind of know when that's going to be.
I wonder, I'd like to just jump into the answer to that is I'm having trouble, and this is John. If we do a conditional use and we have use specific standards for a homeless shelter that must be met, how is that different from a special land use permit? And I think that ties in with Meg's question. That's my hope.
So before the attorneys weigh in, my answer to that is past performance, that these become effectively irrevocable, and only at the goodwill of the operator does change ever happen. And so I'll let the attorneys join in, but my personal experience is exactly that over and over and over again. No matter
but I don't think we're still hanging on to the idea of having a license or a permit in addition to this, which I think.
So it's just a question of the A versus B on the first side. Okay.
But go ahead, is it Quincy or Michelle or Dean?
Well, through the chair, if I may.
Or Chris.
Oh
yeah. Can we to your point that you made for Assemblymember Constant about the hybrid approach that's being proposed, no matter what direction the Assembly chooses, CUP or SLUP, I'm glad you've made that reminder. We would like to get through the rest of the presentation to help stimulate that discussion around not just what could be some use-specific standards, but more broadly, what we've heard from the Assembly is that there's tremendous interest in the licensing requirements, and I think justifiably so. That's one of the key differences, I think, to answer your question, one of the key differences as we envision it right now between the existing conditional use permit process and the process that we're suggesting to the Assembly would be more effective, which is a hybrid system similar to the hybrid system we utilize for special land use permits and licenses for marijuana. So, Michelle, you want to get us there?
Yeah, thank you. So the last slide that I talked about was just the overall conditional use process. So this is in reference to that kind of that hybrid approach. This is one of the two options that we put forward. So this is the same conditional use process flow as I explained. Hopefully everybody was able to hear previously. And except for with the addition of after the Planning and Zoning Commission has taken final action, that there would be a separate process that the Assembly would have to approve a license. Under this scenario, one of the use-specific standards would be a requirement that any state or municipal licenses need to be approved and in good standing in order for the conditional use permit to be valid. And so that would, if that license was something that had to be annually reviewed, I think this gets to some of Mr. Constant's concern about them being hard to revoke, or and operators may have more goodwill to fix the problems if they know that their license is on the line, and that would effectively cancel out their CUP if it was no longer in good standing. The second option that we put forward is a special land use permit. We have this for alcohol and marijuana special land use permits. So this would be a new function in Title 21. So we've mapped out what it would kind of look like, but we would be effectively creating this new process. So we could tweak it. But it mirrors for the most part what the conditional use permit process looks like, except for when you get to the public hearing, it would go to a public hearing to planning and zoning, but instead of them making the final approval, they would be making a recommendation very similar to what they do with a rezone or a zoning map amendment, where they hear it first. They also take public comment. They write a recommendation to the assembly, and then a second additional public hearing is held at the assembly, and then you all would be the final approving body. And that also has the license component that could then meet up with it, if you would, while it's going forward to the assembly, and that could be approved simultaneously, but as a separate kind of piece of paper, if you would.
Okay, Meg, did you want to jump in now?
Yes, I need to understand where. Oh, I'm sorry if I'm echoing. It's echoing on my end. Use specific criteria interplay with the special land use permit or the conditional use permit, and where they would interplay with a license. I'm not as familiar with use specific criteria, and so that's a piece of my knowledge I'm missing as I consider these processes.
So I'm going to jump ahead. This might be easier to show. So what we would do is under 2105, which is the use regulations. So in that chapter of Title 21, it includes both what uses are allowed. It provides a definition of what that use is. And if there are any use specific standards, this is where they live in this section of code. The use specific standards should have a relation to zoning. So for instance, requiring a landscape buffer, but just a landscape buffer between any adjacent properties. That's a zoning related use specific condition. Something that speaks more to the operation of a facility should live as a requirement of a special or use regulation of the license. Does that help?
I think so. So sometimes there could be overlap, like we've talked about secured outdoor area with, for smoking, let's say. That would be, because that's on the exterior. So I'm just trying to remember, that's on the exterior of the building. It has to do with kind of the lot and what has to be on the lot. Would that be
that could be a use specific standard of the conditional use, or just even if something's a permitted use, it can have use. So we might just say you're required to have 500 square feet of open space on the property.
Okay.
But we're not going to direct them that that they have to allow people to smoke there.
Okay, and then that would be maybe where the license criteria overlap with a use specific standard.
Yes.
I put another level of refinement on it. Okay, yes. It's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, I see. Dean, would you like to speak?
Yes, thanks, John. I had a question about the difference in the process in terms of the cost or burden on an applicant. So with the that difference between the conditional use permit and special land use permit is sort of basically final decision makers, the assembly with the SLAP. And we see that we have the public hearing before the Planning Zone Commission, and then another public hearing before the Assembly. So can you give us an idea, Michelle or Chris, what sort of, what's the increased cost or burden on an applicant to pay for these processes? And I think that, and to me, it's sort of, I'm sort of getting at, well, we hear a lot about overregulation, burdening applicants, and so forth. And we have these applicants for homeless shelters, which I think are mostly very altruistic and philanthropic charitable organizations that we don't want to burden too much. I mean, I think that's where we're coming from. But so what are the costs of having these two public hearings as opposed to the one that's in the conditional use permit process?
So sorry, Dean, I was pulling up my fee sheet. So conditional use permits are the costs are associated with are based on acreage of a site. So for each site, it would be dependent on how large it is. The maximum cost is $16,000. I wouldn't suspect that you would get anywhere in that ballpark. I would suspect it'd be somewhere in the $7,000 range. The review process for whatever the special land use permit looks like would probably be very similar to what the conditional use permit process looked like, and we would likely charge a similar fee rate. But I don't believe that there would be an additional cost because they have the license. Chris or Dave, is there an additional cost when they have to do the license for marijuana or alcohol?
Michelle, this is
So
Dave.
through the chair. Oh, go ahead, Dave. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, no, there isn't an additional fee there. We would charge the one fee for the special land use permit and license, and that would be it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Are we done with that? Do you want to continue then, Michelle?
Yeah.
Sure.
Michelle, I have a quick question before we proceed, and this goes back to Quincy. So we're now having this conversation about the dual license and the whatever we choose on the first side. And does this presuppose we've made it through the legal concerns that Quincy has already raised, or is this kind of separate from that? I'm sorry, that's kind of a redundant or a couple minutes ago question, but I'm still trying to wrap my mind around it.
From Chris, from this is Michelle. From my perspective, this is the second. This is just laying out the two options. I guess I haven't heard where there's been a consensus on where everybody has landed, if whether or not we should be just discussing the CUP process with a license, or if they're still desired to explore the special land use permit path.
Perfect, thank you.
When do you want that decision?
As soon as possible. And when I get to the end of this, the reason why is because it's a significantly different path of work that we're going to have to do if it's a special land use permit versus if it's the conditional use, because and I'll speak to that. So why don't I just run through this and then I'll get to those next slides, which will demonstrate why we would need to have a determination sooner than later.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Continue.
So I don't want to, I kind of want to preface these next couple slides with, these aren't things that we're saying, this is what we would add, or these are the only things. This is just the realm of possibility to kind of give everybody an idea of, start thinking about what use specific standards could look like. So if they're not worded 100% or we've missed something, I just want you to know that this isn't, this is just throwing kind of spaghetti noodles at the wall. But some possible use-specific standards that could be considered for the use, and these would be use-specific standards that fall under Title 21 for either the conditional use permit or a special land use permit. So it could address stuff like separation distances from other shelters or protected uses, providing adequate space, interior or even exterior of the building for conducting security searches or other types of health assessments, places to provide centralized shelter operations, making it a requirement to be within certain distance of transit lines, providing adequate indoor space for certain functions like day shelter or even storage, laundry, and also just that the facility we might want to require that they have a look and character that integrates into the neighborhood. Requiring that trash cans be provided and maintained around the perimeter, and then requiring a valid MOA license. And then the language provided was some that I think Mr. Gates came up with that we wanted to capture because it was really well said. I'm going to turn this over to Chris right now because this is his slide. Chris,
so before you move on, just from a functional perspective, sorry, Mr. Chair, but, the issue of immediate ceasing operations doesn't work in the context of a housing or even a temporary sheltering perspective. So while the language is good, it certainly has to be modified. There has to be some 7 days or some mechanism to demobilize.
Good point. Thank you.
Okay, Meg, are you in the queue there, or do we get?
Yes.
We already got you.
No, I am. I wanted to go back to those use-specific standards. I'm still wrapping my head around them a little bit, and I'm sorry. I apologize, but several of those are for like the interior operations of a shelter, and so I guess I was under the impression that it was almost like an interior-exterior distinction, but obviously that's not quite right, because what I'm
Through the chair.
What I'm trying to
Let me.
well.
Oh, I'm sorry. Finish your question.
Sorry.
I thought you were done.
What I'm trying to reconcile is what is the, other than a approval or oversight mechanism, what is the value of a license? Because a license value to me was to talk about and create those operational interior type standards where a lot of these seem to be very duplicative.
So
through the chair, I apologize for cutting you off, Assembly Member Zalatel. This slide in particular, and a couple others, if you recall, they contain a list of items. I just lost the slide, wherever it was.
Which one did you want me to pull?
Go to the conditions, use specific standards. Thank you. So this slide is a combination of suggestions that have come from Assembly members and this work, as well as examples from other communities. The items that are on this list, I think basically or generically, you have the distinction correct about interior or operational requirements being part of a license versus site-specific items that would be part of a potential possible use specific standard. The several of these items that came from other jurisdictions, though, I think fall into that latter category, even though they may be interior oriented. So, for example, suitable laundry, kitchen, etc. It doesn't need to. It's not specific to the operation so much as it's specific to the physical building or the physical space, and so that's where these suggestions on use-specific standards to consider or think about come from. Does that help differentiate it for you?
Yeah, a little bit. So the physical plant plus the exterior are use-specific standards, and then how those standards are met, if there are particular ways to operationalize those things, that would be the detail a license would provide.
So through the chair, yes, that's essentially the way that we're looking at it now. I think another analog in the marijuana world, for example, can be the requirements around physical plant like ventilation, et cetera. that are not tied to the license but are part of the special land use permit.
Okay, thanks.
So Chris, Shruti, do you want to speak to the marijuana permit flow slide?
Yeah, happy to. This is just an example for the participants in today's meeting to understand what a dual process workflow might look like. We have a especially talented municipal planner named Ryan Yell, who created a marijuana permit flow chart for applicants to understand the dual license or dual requirement approach. And it just lays out in steps how those occur. I only inserted this here as a reference for how the dual licensure currently works under special land use permits for marijuana, and with the intent of illustrating that special land use permit or a conditional use permit plus license for a homeless and transient shelter could follow a similar dual track, and we would help lay it out for potential applicants in the community so that they better understood it. And that's really the only reason I inserted that slide, Michelle.
Great, thank you. So kind of getting to more the license standards and potentially what they might look like. And as Chris noted, these are also kind of generic and in response to what we heard from various assembly members. So that's where you can really get into the measurement of the shelter and so defining shelter outcomes and how to measure, requiring that the facility provide specific on-site services, and including meals, life skills training and counseling and those types of programs, requiring that clients must pre-register and limiting the number of walk-ins, incentivizing clients to stay in the shelter and use on-site services, requiring that client agreements are given to all clients prior to entering the shelter, and then enforcing good neighbor policies. I'm not going to speak to the potential homeless court. I think that was one that we took from another community that we're not quite sure of. But the establishing a shelter advisory committee or re-engaging one that may already exist, requiring that an annual report be provided to the assembly, and a variety of others that are appropriate. These, just to kind of go back to that question about the differentiating between kind of use specific standards and license. A lot of times the use specific are ones that are more enforceable by code enforcement. A lot of the ones that were kind of thrown out for the license aren't something that code enforcement can really enforce. And so that's also one of the distinctions between the two. So in looking at both processes, we developed kind of what are the pros and cons of each. So with the conditional use permit license combination, there's minimal changes to Title 21. We're using an existing entitlement process. The assembly would get the approval of the license, which would tie back to the approval of the conditional use permit. And it allows the CUP to remain in place, but revoke the license if needed to either change out operators or allow for that operator to come back into good standing. And from what we've seen so far, it seems like this may have a lower legal risk. However, one of the cons is that it's the PCC has, or Planning and Zoning Commission has, the final approval of the conditional use and not the assembly. Although I think that that's balanced by the fact that the assembly would have approval of the license. For the special land use permit and the license combination, the assembly would have the approval of the special land use permit and the license, and it allows the special land use permit to remain in place, but only revoke the license if, again, the operator needs to be changed out or to otherwise come into good standing. Some of the cons are that there's a lot more changes to Title 21 that will be required. It requires a new entitlement process. And it has, again, from our perspective of what we've seen so far, potentially a higher legal risk with the Fair Housing Act. And so here's a flow chart of what regardless of which path we go forward with, whether it's just the conditional use permit and license or special land use permit and license, either or is going to be required, Title 21 text amendments. And so this is just a flow chart of what that process looks like. The change can be initiated by any of the review or decision-making body. So that can be the assembly, one of the boards or commissions, or the planning department. They are submitted in ordinance form and filed with the director. It has a pretty similar, at this point, kind of a pretty similar path forward as the conditional use permit, in that it's issued a case number, it's uploaded to CityView at least 21 days prior to the public hearing, and it's made available for public review and comment. It's distributed to reviewing agencies and departments. And in this case, the Federation of Community Councils, because it's not one specific property that's being affected, it could be any property within the Anchorage Bowl. So we would do kind of an email blast to everybody within the community, in any community council. The public has the opportunity to provide feedback and comment, and then staff will take those comments and incorporate them into a final staff report, which could result in changes to the AO or the Assembly Ordinance as it was originally drafted. There could be changes based on what we hear from agencies and the public. And then that is brought forward to the Planning and Zoning Commission. They make the findings of facts and accept it with changes if needed. And then they will make a recommendation to the Assembly. The Assembly is introduced, or it's introduced at the Assembly meeting. And then 21 days later, at least, it would be made available for a public hearing. And then the Assembly would ultimately be the approving body, and then the AO would be adopted. And that's just mostly to demonstrate that there is, this in and of itself will take about probably 4 to 6 months, and that's if everything's aligned and we can keep moving. So it's somewhat of a lengthy process, but that's okay. I just want you to be aware of it. So this was a kind of a quick blush, but looking at what changes to Title 21 that would need to be made. If it's the CUP and license combination, the only changes we'll have to make is to Chapter 5, so 2105 use regulations. We'll need to update the table of allowed uses to add a C to the B3 column, so representing that it would be allowed per subject to approval of a conditional use, and then updating the definitions and standards. And that would be so that we could either add use-specific standards, and then also if we need to update that definition per the conversation that took place earlier, that might be one of the things that's prudent to do to differentiate homeless shelter from transitional or habilitative housing. For the special land use permit, it will require a little more substantial changes. So we'll have to update, the Assembly's charge to include that you would also be reviewing this special land use permits for homeless and transient shelter. We would have to change our common procedures. So specifically creating a whole new section on homeless and transient shelter special land use permit and whatever that might look like. And then determining where would appeals be heard for this. And then also updating the use regulations just as we would for the CUP and license combination. So this is the recommended course of action that we presented at the last meeting, but essentially same path. I know that there's still public testimony being taken for 2020-58, but we do recommend that you vote it down. That will provide closure and then kind of allows us to start the revised process. And then we need to identify which process are we going to move forward with. Is it going to be the conditional use with a license or a special land use permit so that we can start drafting that ordinance and getting it out to stakeholders and to the public? and we need to work with the clerk's office to determine who should be in charge of the license, which department or agency should kind of be the head on that, preparing the ordinance, and then going through that Title 21 amendment process. And that's it.
Okay, good. So I think, Chris, are you ahead of Meg or is Meg ahead of Chris? Did you already speak, Chris?
Go ahead,
Content?
go ahead, Meg. My question is in the past.
Okay, so I have a couple of process questions. Thanks, Chris. So I've not been through a substantial Title 21 change, so this will be my first rodeo at this. If we come up with, the AO to move through site-specific or use-specific criteria, and then planning and zoning or staff change those in some salient way that we're not cool with it, when it comes back before the body, is it still fully amendable, or is it just an up or down vote? So that's one of my questions. And the other question is, so I've been charged or am working on the licensing side of this and drafting that. Mechanics of it, I can't quite get my head around, and I apologize. I'm really quite tired, so I'm not as, on the ball as possible right now. But how do those two processes work in tandem so that they make the final outcome makes sense and is workable?
So to your first question, yes, it's fully amendable by the assembly. So you all will have the opportunity to weigh in on the public comments that may be directed to any of those changes that either staff or the Planning and Zoning Commission made, and then also any public hearing comments that you hear. And then yes, you could change that just like you would any other ordinance. I think through an S version, and I think that with the license and the Title 21 amendment, they would go through concurrently, so that as you're tweaking one, you could be tweaking the other to make sure that those changes make sense. I don't know if somebody else maybe someone who was involved in the alcohol and marijuana license might have a better idea of how that worked.
It looks
Well,
like
let's go ahead.
Wanting to
Yeah.
Through the,
Sure. Dean,
through
can
the
you
chair,
go ahead and comment on that?
Actually, through the
Well-
chair, let me finish the answer, if I may, to the first question on the amendment process. So the text amendment process for Title 21 is laid out in code. And as Michelle pointed out, after the full planning and zoning review process and recommendations to the assembly or approval and report to the assembly can take 3 courses. You can approve with amendments, or you can deny, but you must do so based on approval criteria that includes the following: that any proposed amendment will promote public health, safety, and general welfare. Any proposed amendment is consistent with the comprehensive plan and the stated purposes of this title. And lastly, that the proposed amendment is necessary or desirable because of changing conditions, new planning concepts, or other social and economic conditions. So 3 criteria that are decidedly very broad, but just keep that in mind, that those decisions for amending text Title 21 approved by Planning and Zoning must conform to approval criteria or amendment criteria. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Chris. Dean, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, and thank you, Michelle. You explained that very well. And I like how you pointed out the approval criteria is rather broad. It is, but it is important to consider. And we get the recommendation from the Planning and Zoning Commission and their thoughts in applying that criteria to these proposed Title 21 text amendments. There's a section there in the Title 21 text amendments about the Assembly's action, and this part that says the After receiving the recommendation from the Planning and Zoning Commission, the Assembly shall vote to approve with amendments, or deny the proposed amendment based on that criteria. So, Chris, I think you asked, are we stuck with it? Do we have to send it back? And the way I read it is the Assembly can amend whatever they think needs amending, but you want to work with the planning staff carefully, like the criteria that it's consistent with the comprehensive plan, or that it's not affecting licensing and licensing ordinance that's coming online as well. So planning can really dig into the weeds into that kind of thing, but generally the Assembly is not prevented from making changes once it reaches the Assembly from the Planning and Zoning Commission's recommendation. Does that sound right? And so if that's correct, Michelle, I had another comment on that other question about licensing and who should be in charge.
Yes, you're correct, Dean.
Yeah. So someone asked which department should be in charge and so forth. I really think it's a no-brainer. The health department, they already monitor the emergency shelters, under Chapter 16, 120 of our code. And they're just ideally situated for this kind of licensing of homeless shelters. They already administer the licensing program for child care centers, rehabilitative care facilities. So, I'm not sure that which other department would do it or is best situated for it. So we should probably pull in a health department director or designee for these meetings soon. Oh, Nicole's online. Great.
Hi, this is Nicole, and thank you for asking for someone from the health department to be here. Excuse me, I'm listening in and will report out to Natasha. One thing that I did want to point out is that we do receive state grant monies, excuse me, state grant monies to administer the licensing for childcare licensing. And so there's something additional about the cost of starting to consider this as a program that we would additionally need to consider. What are the additional administrative costs that would be associated above and beyond the costs that it would be required of the providers?
Oh, thanks, Nicole.
Do you know how much that would cost?
No, I'm saying we need to ask that question, and if someone needs to have us do some of that research, we could do it. I would also need to see some examples of other states or municipalities or other jurisdictions throughout the country that administer this to help me define that.
Okay, thank you.
And if I may, I think that the health department, that they probably need to evaluate cost based on what licensing criteria we establish. So I think sort of need to refine that list of possible licensing standards, right? And decide which ones we want included, and based on what license standards are included, the health department can then evaluate, well, what inspections need to be done, how do they evaluate it, what experts do they need, and that kind of thing. So they can better develop the cost estimate on a per application basis. Just sort of, that's my thought.
All right, thanks, Dean. So, so it's a little after 2. So I wonder if we can make a decision. Would we go with the special land use permit or conditional use? That's kind of a decision that could be maybe pointed to now. And I wonder, Chris, you have the strongest thoughts on that, but if we have control of a license, would you, I mean, does that give you kind of the leverage that you're worried about? And if the conditional use and the special conditions for the use are done right? And I mean, do you have trouble with the planning commission dealing with that and then
No,
assembly?
Christopher, if you were speaking to me and not Shooty, I'm happy with either of these models. Clearly, the department has made their model, their preferred model clear. And so I don't know why we would not go with their wisdom. We just have to be very careful, and it definitely has to be paired with a reviewable, revocable tool. So with that in mind, yeah, I'm personally fine going with the shortest path. I have some questions, like, since these operations are intended to serve an emergency purpose, can we provide expedited hearing at the Planning and Zoning Commission, meaning bumps other hearings that might be in the queue, not give it less than 21 days, but, you know, are there ways that we can make sure that this works to the benefit of all parties? Until, of course, we need it to work to the detriment of a party. And so there are both sides of that equation I want us to look at as we go a little further down the road. But I'm fine with the conditional use and license. The license is the key.
Okay, and I think Pete Peterson, are you with us? I haven't heard. I got a text. I thought he said he was here. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead. So, okay, so do we have anyone feel different on that? Go ahead with the conditional use and then license on the assembly side.
John, this is Meg. I was in the queue. Yeah, I think I've been I think I've been convinced between Quincy's research and then kind of walking through this again. I shared the similar concerns of Mr. Constant. I do want to make sure, though, because there's still a risk with the Fair Housing Act and even doing the conditional use plus the license, that we really focus on what it means for us to license homeless and transient shelters versus other types of operations. And then I would, of course, take, if it all is going to potentially hinge on the license side of it in terms of enforcement, definitely take some volunteers to help.
To help do what?
Draft the licensing. I mean, Dean and I've been working on it. Chris weighed in a little bit, but like, if that's really going to be, that's kind of on our, well, I understand it's been in my court, and I have to say it got pushed aside for a while, but we really need to make sure we're having a good conversation about that, because if that's where the meat is, and then it needs to be reasonably enforceable. So then obviously we need to loop back with the health department as well.
Okay, I don't think I've seen what you've got so far. Can you, maybe Mandy can email that to everyone on the committee?
Well, we had a working group. We didn't have a subcommittee, so it's been limited in numbers, to three members or less. So I guess we need to talk about what format we want that to take, or does it go into a subcommittee like this? I think that drafting process could get really clunky then, but we should probably talk about that if we are comfortable with the Title 21 changes moving forward for the conditional use. On the land use side, then we should figure out how we're going to move the other step forward.
Okay, now's the time.
Through the chair, Mr. Weddle.
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. In response to that, we didn't clearly articulate it in our final slide here, but the process as described by Assemblymember Zalatal is what we've envisioned, and we're basing that off of how we worked on the marijuana special land use permit and licenses many years ago. It was a working group. There were representatives from planning, legal, the clerk's office, OECD for a little bit, and somebody else I'm probably forgetting, but short answer is, while we don't spell it out very or completely in item number 2 on this list here, the process is that process that she described is what we're envisioning as well, and would love to participate and help facilitate that, if you want to call it a subcommittee or a working group, the work.
Okay. So, I mean, is this subcommittee okay to do that? I mean, Meg, would that work? Can we just do it within this group?
So
I think Chris wants to weigh in on that first. So, and he's been a part of the underlying group too.
Okay, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, the underlying element that we have to address now is all of this heat from the public and make light out of it. And the way that we do that is figure out a way to take this process and invite their input into what these criteria might be. I understand that probably makes a fair housing attorney's skin crawl, which I understand the concern there, because we're going to get all kinds of crazy things sent our way, but we're probably going to get some really good ideas too that aren't ours, and we can show the public that we've actually sought their input on this very question that is going to be where this venue shifts to if this conversation continues and we do whatever we're going to do on 66 or 58. And so I want us to be cognizant of the need to bring in more broad representation of the community into this conversation, even at the more nuanced nuts and bolts level. And I don't know how that works. My gut tells me this is where we need to bring people in.
Well, that's a good idea, Chris. And I actually jotted some notes for my comments on 58 when we get to it. And that's to say that we are doing this. And I think, so it sounds like we'll have at least probably till Monday and certainly announce that these meetings are going on as a minimum.
This Meg, yeah, I'm comfortable with that. I think we need to, if we're going to invite the public, I mean, this is going to be true sausage making at its best, where we're really going to be digging into what, I mean, my initial instinct was to come up with at least an initial framework, and I have a bit of one, and Dean's helped me work through it, that we utilized Sadie when she was interning to kind of take marijuana, adapt it. Dean and I have adapted it more, and then, you know, kind of create the framework so then we could more easily absorb the public comment, I guess, so that we could still move a final, like move toward a final ordinance or, you know, and licensing scheme. I'm afraid to do it without a framework because I think we can go down a million rabbit holes in this area. And I want to make sure we're involving the coalition as well. And it's really great that Nicole is on the line with us because they have through their continuum of care requirements for HUD, some standards and guidelines that need to be put together. And so we kind of paused the effort to see where that was headed, but now we have this new sense of urgency. So it doesn't make sense to do it twice if we can do it collectively, as long as we all understand the framework. That felt a little circular, I apologize, but I don't want to be like, here's a blank slate, let's throw everything at it. I want there to be something that we're agreeing moves it forward.
So before Dean jumps in, I would just offer, I agree with that, and I would suggest there might be some symbolic people who can be meaningfully in the earlier groups, are not the broader public at large. So it could be.
Who are you thinking, Chris?
You know, I'm trying to sort through all of the people, like the guy who was the commercial real estate broker, who was so reasonable. I've had a lot of deep thoughts, you know. I don't know, but along those lines, or someone from the FCC who is brought in. So I just don't know the answer, but I think the question should stay open before we finish this framework, but long before we move a document forward, it would be nice to have that perspective close inside.
Yeah, I think, Meg, your idea on the framework's good, because it's not just the license, but also those, use requirements. And if we could get a definition of what those should be, and like we talked about more, about the site, we'll see 20-foot tall fence with barbed wire or something, and then these, the things for the license, and kind of define what those should be. That would help the public focus. I help all of us focus, I think. Dean, you want to go ahead?
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Well, I had the same concerns that Meg mentioned, so I won't repeat those. But just if we just open it to early public involvement, it's, I think, going to become a mess and a whole bunch of rabbit holes to go down. So I completely agree that we should first get a framework and probably develop a list of our licensing standards and criteria and the conditional use permit use specific standards that I think the assembly members here, planning staff, at least think are good, and maybe also have a list of what I think we hear a lot of people testifying about in the past week about AO 2020-58. Some of the ideas that people mention when they're testifying are probably going to lead us down to a Fair Housing Act lawsuit. And I think that we should probably, before we open up to the public, say these are things that we really cannot do. And Quincy has described some of them to us already. So I think that would be important so that we can focus the conversation going forward and not get sidetracked. So I think for the public engagement, that I think it should be a little bit later. We first come out with our framework and some use and criteria list, and then involve some stakeholders first, like the coalition and community councils, and then go more public. I think that would be a little help streamline our drafting.
That makes sense in our normal way of doing things, but we're finding out our normal way of doing things really ticks off some people. Nicole, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you so much. I guess I would just really want us to be clear on the general timeline of when we would be expecting for this work to start and be completed. I also would want us to acknowledge that this licensure, unlike others that have been referenced, like marijuana or childcare, which are both for-profit services, this is a licensure for a different. It's not a for-profit service, and so sort of coming up with what restrictions or how we would address the fact that those are two different business lines, basically, if I can call it that. I also want to offer that I am on the compliance committee of the advisory board for the coalition, and so I'm happy to take this to that committee and see what type of work and on what timeline we could start that work, because I do think it's going to be very valuable to get provider input to drive some of what is possible rather than having it be imposed. I do know that before COVID happened and we had started to have these conversations, it created a lot of stressing and anxiety for the providers to have something sort of placed on top of them rather than co-created. And then lastly, I just want to reiterate my request to have examples from other states or local jurisdictions that have licensure requirements of this nature, from other states for homeless shelters, and that would be extremely instructive. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, Nicole, are you aware of similar things in other places? Or are you asking us?
Oh, sorry, go ahead. I'm so sorry.
Okay, because I've been looking.
Yes, I will share some of the research that we have on some of the jurisdictions with you, Nicole.
That's glorious. Thank you.
Crystal, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Well, I guess just in general, I want to comment that I'm really kind of pleased with how the conversation is beginning to gel a little bit better, at least I feel like I'm seeing a better path forward over all of this right now. So this is all good to hear. And I'm also glad that Meg and Dean have kind of begun putting kind of a draft list together of all those particular use specific standards that might need to go into this. And I just had a question from either one of them. Were you all looking at specifically a separation distance from, say, any place that's selling alcohol or marijuana? I just wondered if that was one of the things you were already considering, if that was part of your conversation already. Thanks.
Crystal, no, this is Meg. We were looking at the licensing requirements. We weren't necessarily looking at use-specific requirements in quite the same way. We were more in the nuts and bolts of operations.
Okay.
Yes, and if I could add, I think any separation distance or identifying protected uses from or protected from homeless shelters is really going to be a litigation concern. So she wouldn't vet any of that with legal.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Chris, you have a.
Yep, thank you. So just in response to Ms. Lebo's comment about the what's possible for the providers. This whole conversation for me is very long and old and tired. I appreciate the framing of what we need to do is have them at the table so they don't feel like it's getting laid on them, but they're being part of the conversation. But I think that's somewhat different than weighing in and having them tell us what they can and cannot do. My experience now going on 12 to 15 years is that they will tell you they can't do any of it, and they will be allowed to continue doing none of it other than the things that cause the harms. What happens inside their doors I can't speak to. And so to me, the concern is helping to motivate them through whatever mechanism we have and need to do, which if it's positive support, please be part of this conversation, great. But to realize that they can't do what they have done before because this community is going to expect more.
All right, thanks. Okay, we just have a few more minutes. Do we, I guess Nicole said how fast are we gonna work? We want to work fast. What do we want to do for another meeting?
So John, this is Meg, if I may. I'd like to do this. I would like to figure out a kind of a dual path forward. One path is the more informal work group that's gonna be a convening of kind of a core group of folks who are gonna like get some language down on paper and work through it. And then the other being back to the subcommittee on some kind of regular interval where we can talk through what we have and see what we're missing and get feedback as we go. So I think we probably need, well, I guess it depends how many more special meetings we have, but probably I would say realistically to kind of clean up the framework we currently have, probably need a week or two and to like kick it back out to those who were initially involved to make sure they're comfortable, then bringing it forward and start to kind of, you know, dissect that part and move it forward. And then we can go back, you know, kind of do this dance back and forth to keep it moving and keep it transparent at the same time.
So you want to do stuff by email? Is that what you're saying, and get something tied up?
What I'd like is a work group of 3 or less members plus, you know, some key administration staff to kind of shape it up and then bring it back to the subcommittee, dig into it, and then kind of go back and deal with whatever the subcommittee is determined needs to be fixed or changed, you know, and kind of do that. And then also work through some public meetings as we agree as a subcommittee. It's time for some additional inputs.
Okay, so like a week from now, or what's your thought?
Well, as I was just saying, a week to a week and a half partly it's just dependent on our meeting schedule. And, you know, a little bit of my day job. So it's already the second to last week in August. We could talk about reconvening again the first week of August, perhaps. I mean, I would love others to weigh in on that timeline if that makes sense for them, because I do know we have some other things that are going to take, you know, Dean's time and others who are going to have to be integral to this.
Yeah. I don't know. I just try to be flexible.
I'm good with what Meg suggested.
Okay, so you're looking, so sometime first week of August. Do you want to not set a time quite yet then? You want to look at what you have and send it around and then kind of see, we do want to wait, I guess, and see how quickly you get things together, Meg?
Yeah, why don't I put together a proposed time so that if you want to bring it up, if it's Monday that we're debating, and you want to make some announcement about it, then you'll have a meeting date by then.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, okay. Okay, well, we got to wrap her up. Anything else from anyone?
Mr. Chair, John?
Is that Crystal? Go
That's
ahead.
Crystal, yeah. Well, I just wanted some clarification then in terms of exactly what Meg and Dean are really going to work on. Are they really just working on the licensure part of this, or any of the site-specific, use-specific standards too?
Meg?
So it was my understanding that the licensure side was what kind of the assembly was going to lead, and that the use specific side would be more from the planning staff. And of course, we would coordinate that so that it was complementary and made sense, but that would kind of be the division of labor.
No, that
And
helps.
through the
That
chair, this
clarifies
is
it.
Chris Schutte. That's our understanding as well, and that the license work and the Title 21 text amendment work, both of that reports back to this committee for decision points and updates and things like that.
Okay, I'm good with that. Thanks.
Input then before we're done. You know, let's also have a conversation in the short term about depending what happens over the next week on the proposed purchased facilities, because I think that will help us illustrate the conflicts and context of the fair housing questions, because I believe the Spenard property will by all means fall under protection of the Fair Housing Act, but the Midtown one may or may not. And so I hope that we can put some color to those conversations through the vehicles that we may or may not have before us early next week.
Okay. All right. Anything else? It's time to adjourn. See you guys in a couple hours.
Thank you.